So I think you're making the case here for, why criminalizing hate speech or speech in general is a problem, potential problem. And you've also mentioned in some of the things you've written that actually some of the building blocks for actually doing that exist as we speak.
There are two areas from which this emerges. The first, as I mentioned a little bit before, is civil rights law, and especially the bureaucracy that is the outgrowth of 1960s civil rights laws. Again, the goal was to get rid of discrimination in housing, in employment, and in public accommodations, which are noble tasks. But when that is not enough, it is pretty clear that that bureaucracy can expand into the workplace, can expand into public universities, can indefinitely expand in order to shut down speech which it does not like, which it views as discriminatory. And the EEOC, for example, is already in the process of testing the waters on that, as some of their directives show. The next area in the law where, again, there is a precedent already laid down is in the court cases that led up to the 2015 ruling of Obergefell versus Hodges, where Justice Kennedy says that we have a right to choose our own identity, and that identity must be recognized by others. And what that essentially means is that if others don't recognize my chosen sexual identity, for example, my transgender identity, then that harms me. That does a fundamental harm to me if they don't recognize me, if they criticize me, or if they are simply silent about my identity. Because as we know now, silence is a form of violence. And I think that ambitious lawyers, the political party that is interested in furthering this hate speech regime will act out, will advocate for using these two precedents. One last thing that I'll mention, which is, I think, perhaps the most alarming of all, is that just recently, our national security infrastructure has announced that it too will be policing speech, radical speech, as they claim, supremacist speech, whatever that means. But what we know, as they say in their own words, they will be on guard for one thing specifically, or two things I should say. One is mentions of deep state and mentions of global elite. So they have so far, in their kind of not fully worked out way, declared that these kinds of thoughts will be sought after in both the social media of their recruits, and we simply don't know where else, in the public at large. And this, I think, is one of the most significant developments of the past generation, that the national security state will now be openly focusing on speech that it disapproves, without any possibility of moderating what they're doing, without any possibility for adjudication of those that will be punished. It's a shocking thing.
Well, so the obvious question, we've been talking about kind of various vantage points of this question of free speech, of identity politics, the intersection of those. What you just described is, I agree, sounds very deeply disturbing. Probably a lot of our viewers are feeling this way. What can people do in this sort of a climate? It seems to be accelerating, right, as you describe.
Well, there are a couple of paths. First, we should think about which institutions have a disproportionate power over policing speech and thought. So one I've named before is Google. It's unconscionable, in my view, that one company not only controls 90% of the world's searches and therefore is essentially the portal into the internet, but the internet in our time has become the public square. print is declining, cable is declining, with each quarter more and more. And the internet is where a lot of political speech takes place, where citizens rule themselves, persuade one another, etc. And so no free country could tolerate that one corporation could define what it is and is not possible to say, and could moreover attempt to skew the kind of information that is available so as to benefit their moral worldview. So that's one. Another is the universities. My view is that the universities have been captured by a very radical element of the left for quite some time now. And I don't think that a free people needs to tolerate these kinds of things. These universities, nearly all of them, depend on federal and state budgets. Well, the state of Florida, its citizens, can very easily defund the University of Florida. No offense to it, I don't know anything about it, but just to use that one example. So there are avenues that have not yet been tried that are clearly available and that are above board and legal. But more importantly, while the freedom of speech still exists in America, we have to speak out against these very dangerous and unjust ideologies. Elaborate what they do, what they say, elaborate the kind of America that they want to create. I think that there are a great deal of men and women of goodwill on both sides which find these kinds of racialized caste systems and the castigation of oppressor groups, they find them unconscionable. And so to speak about these things is extremely important.
One suggestion that I heard recently was actually from Dinesh D'Souza. His suggestion is create new online universities with a very reasonable cost to them, and you can quickly, displace all sorts of academic institutions in this country. What are your thoughts?
I hope so. I think that's possible. I think that we as a people believe way too strongly in credentialing. And that one of my friends once said, can you imagine what would have become of Abraham Lincoln, this kind of self-taught genius, had he gone to Harvard today? I think that there's a lot of good sense and good practical wisdom in a lot of Americans. And I actually think that college has begun to distort them and deform them intellectually and morally. And so maybe online alternatives are good. I'm a very deep believer in liberal education. But broadly speaking, I think that what needs to take place is the creation of solid, intelligent apprenticeship programs, so as to avoid making college the end-all, be-all credentialing institution.
And then, so what about Google? Are you advocating that Google be, say, broken up through antitrust law? How do you expect to deal with, well, let's not just focus on Google, but big tech in general?
Well, I think that Google is the main one. It's the most powerful, it's the most successful, it has the broadest reach. My view is that conservatives have talked about Section 230 reform and walked into this bizarre trap whereby I think for the past couple of years, they just tried to use it as a bludgeon and a threat because it was never going to have the effect that they wanted. I think that we have a long tradition of using antitrust laws in order to make the public, in this case, make the public square more Republican, make it freer. If in 1950 the New York Times gathered up enough capital to buy 90% of all American newspapers, and therefore to use that power to effectively determine the outcome of elections by persuading people of wrong things or limiting the flow of information, no American would have thought that, well, that's perfectly normal. We should just live with that. That's a great idea. So there are avenues available to us, but regrettably, many people have been sleeping for a very long time in thinking that things just work themselves out somehow. But that's not what statesmanship is.
And just presumably by more Republican, you mean lowercase Republican, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean self-rule, both at the local, the state, and the national level. Absolutely. I don't mean a party.
America is the only country in the world that I'm aware of that has freedom of speech enshrined in the way that it does. And you're suggesting the loss of freedom of speech is kind of the loss of the nation. But there are other countries out there that have done pretty well for themselves, right? So folks from these countries might be looking at this wondering, hey, it doesn't seem as extreme as it is, as what you're claiming here. Your thoughts?
It's a reasonable question. You're right that we are the country with the freedom of speech enshrined in our Constitution, but many other countries, the UK, Canada, Australia, the Anglosphere, have been practicing the freedom of speech for a very long time. And since about the 70s, they are running a very dangerous experiment. And the experiment is get rid of the freedom of speech by legislating against hate speech and see if that brings about peace, order, and prosperity. And I think that the answer is more or less clear, that these countries more and more are run by administrations rather than politics, that there's a great deal of unrest that is shooed under the carpet, especially among various ethnic groups, and that what ends up happening is that you have a kind of light tyranny that perpetuates itself by spreading wealth. And the question is that a sustainable model? Are there a lot of real antagonisms in those countries that cannot be paid off forever? And the freedom of speech would have been a means to either prevent that circumstance or to find some kind of moderate compromise once you're in it.
Well, any final thoughts before we finish up?
Many people have, especially in Washington, have specializations. They work on agricultural policy or tax policy or whatever it is. And those issues are important. But my view is that the freedom of speech really is a civilizational level question. If we lose it, this country is in very bad shape and will not recover. But if we preserve it, then America will be able to preserve, because it will be able to advocate for all of the benefits, the things that we continue to draw our affections to this nation, the equal rule of law, the prosperity of the sciences, the prosperity of commerce. All of those things require a country where the freedom of speech exists so that abuses can be corrected, so that the tracks continue to run. So I think that with the loss of the freedom of speech, the country regrettably descends into an unrecognizable form of some kind of soft despotism that will be maybe almost impossible to get ourselves out of.
Well, Arthur Milik, it's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.